On this day, 1993, Martin Scorsese's extraordinary adaptation of Edith Wharton's novel The Age of Innocence opens in theaters.
Your whole world or your heart. From the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, director Martin Scorsese invites you to experience The Age of Innocence. Daniel Day-Lewis, Michelle Pfeiffer, Winona Ryder.
Shall I come to you?
Come to me. The Age of Innocence.
And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here on this kind of weather Tuesday here in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So today marks 2 separate film anniversaries in the illustrious career of Oscar winner Martin Scorsese. Now, the more famous of the 2 films, which celebrates an anniversary today, is Goodfellas, which opened wide on September 17th of 1990. But I literally just did an episode on Goodfellas as part of my Great Movies series. So we're going to skip past, I'm just kidding, but we're not going to talk Goodfellas today other than this kind of brief opening setting the stage. 3 years after Goodfellas and following a protracted editing process, certainly the most intense, from my understanding, the most intense and lengthy editing process of Mr. Scorsese's esteemed career, The Age of Innocence, Martin's incredible adaptation of Edith Wharton's novel, opened in theaters September 17, 1993. Now, I have discussed 1993. It is my opinion, this is purely opinion, this is all subjective. It is my opinion that 1993 is the single greatest year in the history of Hollywood. The quality of films throughout the year, the number of all-timers in that year sets it apart. Now, there are those, and I had a back and forth with an author, film scholar by the name of Brian Raftery, who wrote a book. In his book, he argued that it was actually 1999 and not 93, because the general understanding is the 70s and the 90s are the 2 best decades, certainly as far as Hollywood goes. I take the 90s over the 70s. I also think that Hollywood, from a marketing perspective, never packaged and marketed their product better than they did in the 90s. But that's also, that's also subjective, and that's neither here nor there. But 1993 is the year of Schindler's List. And I could sit here and name like at least 50 films that are either great masterpieces or approaching great and masterpiece. So Martin Scorsese's The Age of Innocence, it's hard to imagine that he could ever make a film which slipped below the radar, but this one did. Now, there were certain critics when it landed that immediately hit the ceiling, like, holy fuck. On the surface, it doesn't appear to be the kind of movie, the kind of story that Martin Scorsese would necessarily have been excited to get into and make, even if he had been a fan of the book as a much younger person when he was just a brilliant academic and a kid who talked a billion miles a minute, 170, 180 IQ or whatever it is in actuality. When I was at New York University Film School, now this is a bit of a shameful admission, not the film school part, I did not see The Age of Innocence in theaters, even though in 1993 I went to the movies a lot. in 1993. I probably saw at least 20 films from that year in theaters. Classic titles such as Schindler's List, such as The Fugitive, In the Line of Fire, the Rookie of the Year. I didn't see Free Willy in theaters. But you understand what I'm saying. Oh, Groundhog Day, Last Action Hero. It was an absolutely stacked year. But when The Age of Innocence hit, it didn't look that interesting. And even though I was already an enormous fan of Martin Scorsese, there were other films that took my attention that I went to see. Remains of the Day, In the Name of the Father, Shadowlands. So I didn't see it in theaters, even though there were critics calling it the best film of the year. And when the year ended and critics put together their 10 best lists, this was just before a lot of people were on the internet, college kids, but I wasn't yet, and I hadn't even started New York University. But most what I would call 10 best lists, now it's online, is thousands and thousands of 10 best lists. When I say that, circa 1993, I'm talking about the Siskel and Eberts and the film critics on television and that sort of thing. There were critics that placed The Age of Innocence above Schindler's List for Best Picture. That surprised me. But I still didn't see the movie, and for whatever reason, I didn't rent it. It just didn't look interesting. So when I got to NYU, which was fall 1994, I learned that Martin Scorsese had actually taught an advanced seminar, because what else would he teach? He taught an advanced seminar in the fall of 1993. So 1 year before I got there, in the cinema studies department, people who were a year ahead of me, I'm sure they used some kind of a bingo, a lottery system or something, because you have a class with only 15. The advanced seminars, I don't think they even had as many as 15. Everybody would have wanted into that class. We wouldn't even, well, is he a good teacher? Who the fuck cares? Are you kidding? So that was a little depressing that I had missed him by a year. So yeah, he was teaching while his movie was in theaters. I didn't see the film, and I learned the story of him that people who knew of it said the guy was a great teacher on top of everything else, that he was fantastic, that he actually had almost unlimited patience with the students, as if we needed to like Martin Scorsese. And remember, he's a little cute little old guy now. This is the Martin Scorsese who was around 50. They're at the same age I am now. This is not the adorable little old guy. This is a guy still vital, still vibrant. He's still vital and vibrant as far as a filmmaker, but he was still very much at his physical peak. He had overcome his addiction issues and was really doing great. And they said he was fucking amazing as a professor. So when I took a class called Color in Cinema, which was the spring of 1995, I noticed that one of the films on the syllabus was The Age of Innocence. And I said, well, at least now I'm going to have to watch it, as if it was like something bad, a negative. And I don't know where I came up with the idea that I was going to hate this movie, but to me, it seemed like an enormous departure for Martin Scorsese. And I remember the professor of Color in Cinema, Professor McElhenney. I asked a question the week we were screening The Age of Innocence. I didn't read Edith Wharton's book. I know that it's on some curriculums in certain schools or in high school. I did not read it. I was vaguely familiar with it, and I remember seeing the trailer for the movie, which it just didn't make me want to go to see it. So I said, why do you think that Scorsese decided to make such an enormous departure from, Goodfellas, Raging Bull, and even A Cape Fear, and Last Temptation of Christ, and those kinds of movies? Why do you think he made such a departure? And the professor looked me dead in the eye and said, you haven't seen the movie, have you? No. Then he gave me a look, almost a scolding gaze. He said, Mr. Cohen, this is not a departure. This movie is a companion piece to Goodfellas. A number of people in the class laughed. The ones who had not seen The Age of Innocence. I didn't laugh. I was surprised that he was speaking to me in the way that he was, so I was a little bit taken aback. In actual point of fact, when you watch The Age of Innocence, with what I just said in mind, it does play like a companion piece to Goodfellas. Now, to be clear, the characters of Newland Archer, that's the Daniel Day-Lewis character, and Day-Lewis had already won a Best Actor Oscar a number of years earlier for My Left Foot. He was generally regarded to be one of the finest working actors. He had a long way to go, as we know. But Daniel Day-Lewis is Newland Archer, Michelle Pfeiffer's Countess Olenska, and Winona Ryder's May, and the other characters in their social strata. They don't use guns. They don't use physical violence. But it is a rigid caste system, New York City of the very late 19th century, I guess it is. And it is very much like the fucking mob, where people may speak politely, but they're anything but polite. And there are those who are castigated, who are excommunicated, sound familiar? Who are written off simply because they married the wrong guy and he beat the crap out of her, shh, don't say anything about it. She is no longer viable. That's not okay. She can't. What did she do? Doesn't matter. Seeing the film after the professor explained, this is a companion piece to Goodfellas. Holy shit. The Age of Innocence is as good as any movie released in 1993, as any movie released, well, as any Scorsese film. And I'm the biggest Taxi Driver fan there is, but if somebody says that The Age of Innocence is just as good, I don't have any quibble. Nothing. So what Scorsese did here, his original intention, and this, I don't know that you necessarily can Google this. This is real insider information, secondhand. I had a teaching assistant the previous semester, and this was something that I dismissed until seeing the film in full. The teaching assistant worked with Martin Scorsese as he was, after he finished principal photography, and the film, originally, the idea was the movie was going to come out in 1992. Scorsese thought it was going to be a much longer cut, and this part, I don't know the mechanics of why he did not release a longer cut, why he decided to edit it into at 2 hours and 20 minutes, whatever the final runtime is. I don't know. But this teaching assistant said that he was kicking around the idea of a 3-hour cut. And I thought that was interesting, but I hadn't seen the film. I'm always fascinated with not necessarily, director's cuts, but rough cuts. And then, an assembly cut, like Blade Runner, there were issues. There was assembly cut, director's cut, international cut. But I thought it was pretty incredible that he set out to make one movie, as James Cameron did with The Abyss, where he made a 3-hour cut. And Rupert Murdoch, forced him to cut a half hour, and he fucked up the film. So I was wondering, would Scorsese's longer cut have been better? It's all conjecture. But understanding, having then seen the film, it's perfect. And a longer cut could not have made the film any better. It hits every point that the filmmaker is trying to make on his own obsessions, the things that drive him, while still doing justice to Edith Wharton's novel. Something that went past me and would have gone completely past me upon first viewing is just how gorgeous this film is. Almost every shot looks like an impressionist painting. This isn't something that necessarily would have landed for me as a kid. I don't really give a shit. But as somebody who now was studying the use of color in cinema, it was hitting. And I was in awe. Professor McElhaney actually screened the movie again the following week. We watched the entire movie 2 weeks in a row. That is how much he personally got out of this and how much he wanted us to understand. This is not just any old, nice-looking period piece. This is one of the great works of cinema. Now, just within the New York University, the Cinema Studies department of the day, there were some people that were not fans of the film. But then again, the chairman of the department at the time, William Simon, fucking genius. He was a Kubrick scholar, and it sounds absurd. He actually was a friend of Stanley Kubrick. Like, the Stanley Kubrick was on friendly terms with William Simon. William Simon's favorite Stanley Kubrick film was Barry Lyndon. He thought Barry Lyndon was one of the 5 greatest movies ever made. Like, period. I wouldn't even have it in my Kubrick top 6. So that's where you get into the kind of subjectivity of being a film snob, film geek, whatever, phrase you want to say. People went into The Age of Innocence, if regular fans who aren't prepped, they go in thinking it's a love story. Well, it is. And thinking it's about passion. It is. But it's about so much more. And it has a lot to say about the kind of herd mentality and about people who appear to have free will, but in reality don't. And man, if that isn't a telling thing, if that isn't something that many of us can relate to, you could have class, literally and figuratively. You can have a lot of money. You could be an exceedingly attractive person physically. but sometimes you're just fucked. Sometimes shit just keeps raining down on you and there's nothing you can do about it. The Age of Innocence is, if it's not the most beautiful film I've ever seen, it's in the top 2 or 3. Now, this is one movie where Scorsese did take great care where trying to cram as much narrative information into every possible frame. It's something that Ridley Scott does and has continued to do, which I always appreciate. The closest approximation where I'm going with this is, when I think of films with impossible levels of detail just within every frame, Blade Runner is one. That's Ridley's, 1982, the science fiction classic, which I think is the greatest science fiction film ever made. But the level, the depth of the image, what Scorsese does in The Age of Innocence, it's next level. It's almost impossible. And part of the editing was him continuing to say, am I getting absolutely everything I can in every frame of film? And this is levels of perfectionism, but at the same time, respect for one's craft and respect for one's own talent, knowing that, Martin, I could go a little further. I could do more. I can edit this film even better. So The Age of Innocence, it did just okay, if memory serves, at the box office. It was not a runaway hit, but this was not a movie that was ever going to be an enormous hit. This is, sad to say, a critic's movie. This is a film snob's movie. This is a movie for people like me to get into. And the average person who just wants to be told a cool story, an exciting story, a story with a lot of conflict and heroes and villains, this isn't that movie. This was never going to be that movie. Edith Wharton's novel was not that. And before I forget, this is one of those kind of ridiculous bits of trivia. So there is a voiceover, speaking of Blade Runner, the controversial voiceover of Blade Runner, but there is a voiceover in The Age of Innocence. And Martin Scorsese has discussed this. The voiceover, it's supposed to be the voice of Edith Wharton. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's supposed to be almost as if the actual author of the book is narrating her own story to the audience. But the voice, obviously it's not Edith Wharton's, it's Joanne Woodward, Paul Newman's wife for decades. And I don't think that she's still around. He's been gone 16 years, but Joanne Woodward actually provided the voice of Edith Wharton. And it's a little bit, she almost sounds like she's having fun with it, the way that she reads the lines, and almost ironically commenting on what the characters are experiencing and undergoing in the world of the film. Now, the other thing I want to point out is when we say things like critics, when we talk about film criticism, when we talk about interviews with filmmakers, there are different kinds of interviews with filmmakers. So, for example, when Christopher Nolan did the publicity tour for Oppenheimer last year, there were so many different kinds of interviews he gave. There were some which were modestly intellectual, where he was able to really break down some of the shots that he did. I remember he spent about a half hour on, I think, CBS Sunday Morning, and the anchors didn't really know that much about the process of making movies, but they were able to ask him what I thought were some very, very solid questions. But then there'll be interviews like Entertainment Weekly where they don't even scratch the surface. So when Martin Scorsese was promoting Age of Innocence, and this was something that Professor Mack told us, we got such a kick out of this, and it's not something we would have considered, but he was right. So Scorsese, again, the days before everything was on the internet, he sat for a number of interviews with various print media publications to talk about The Age of Innocence. Just saying he's going to sit to talk about the movie. He's going to be interviewed about the movie, depending on the publication, the level of seriousness of the questions. It's a Mount Everest distance. So Entertainment Weekly, although a serious magazine for what it was worth, and once a week, they're asking Martin Scorsese questions like, what's it like working with Michelle Pfeiffer? Is she really as attractive in person as she appears on TV and on screen? In Film Comment, interviewing Martin Scorsese about The Age of Innocence, They're asking him questions like, what was the frame rate and what aperture setting did you have when you pulled off that unbelievable rack focus during one of the opera sequences? That's not a question that you're normally going to get asked. It took film comment to ask a real nuts and bolts filmmaking question. That's the kind of question that I guarantee you Christopher Nolan wanted to get asked. They said when Martin Scorsese received that question from, I don't remember who interviewed him for Film Comment. I don't think it was Richard Schickel, although I know he was on staff. That was the old Time magazine critic. They said Scorsese, when he began to talk about his process, was as giddy as a schoolboy. 30 years ago. We saw him last year, the behind the scenes of directing Killers of the Flower Moon, how excited he was hopping around the set like a little kid. When you give a genius an opportunity to explain their process, absolute gold. So Martin, and you could actually look this up, in Film Comment, he gave, I think, a 1.5-page long answer how he achieved that look and that shot that he was asked about in Film Comment. It's almost like he put in all that fucking work on a shot that it went right over my head. I didn't know it was what he did it in the hope that someone was going to ask him how he achieved it. Hey, you know what? Whatever you do, but I'll never forget that. And, you know, in actual experience of watching the movie, it is a bit of a difficult film. And it's not the sort of movie that people would have, oh my God, you've got to see it. There are moments of great passion. There is a sense of a great love within the world of the movie. But nothing develops the way that we think it's going to. This is a very unconventional film. For reference, Scorsese's later film from, 9 years later, Gangs of New York, is a more conventional story, even though that movie, he took a lot of chances, and that is fucking brutal. Daniel Day-Lewis as Bill the Butcher, of course. Leonardo as Amsterdam Valen. Gangs of New York and The Age of Innocence are set. It's not the same time period, but it's close. It's in the ballpark. And obviously Gangs of New York deals with the lower ebbs, the lower dregs of society, whereas Age of Innocence, at least in theory, is showing us high class, high society. They're all fucking scumbags. Or I shouldn't say all. 80% of them all suck. And that's just the way it goes. There's really no escape from the system within which Newland Archer finds himself. In the immortal words of Al Pacino, who only worked with Martin once in The Irishman, but in the immortal words of Al Pacino, as much as he yearns to break free, as much as he wants to conceive of a different life for himself, Daniel Day-Lewis's Newland Archer is what? I'm just a spoke on the wheel. As Big Al said in Donnie Brasco, when explaining his life in the mob, right? Goodfellas, Donnie Brasco, The Age of Innocence. Newland Archer is no more than a spoke on the wheel, or, in the words of Pink Floyd, he's just another brick in the wall. And it is an extraordinary film, and it's readily available on streaming, but it is a bit of a challenging watch. And also, it is a film that it's not that you should watch it if you're a big movie fan, if you're a Scorsese completist, but just to appreciate the level of artistry, because sometimes you can appreciate art just for how beautiful it is. I will go down on the hill that this is top 3 most beautiful films, certainly I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot. The most painterly movie that Scorsese has ever made, and the most narrative information crammed into every image. Didn't take any scenes off. And if it's not certainly the most expansive or the broadest performance of Daniel Day-Lewis's career, he's really solid in the film. And Michelle Pfeiffer it's a marvelous performance from her. I know she was Oscar nominated the previous year for Love Field. 92 was not really a great year it wasn't a great year for cinema. It was just okay. But Michelle did not get nominated for this. And The Age of Innocence, maybe because of the strength of the year and because a lot of people just didn't get it. A lot of the members of the Academy just didn't get the fuss and why so many people were saying, holy fuck, this is as good as Raging Bull, this is as good as Taxi Driver. They just didn't get all of the hubbub. It's a movie that needed to be reappraised, and I believe it has been reappraised, and now you won't find any reviews of less than this film is fucking phenomenal. It's up there with a master's best achievements, and that is really saying something. 31 years ago today, Martin Scorsese's The Age of Innocence opened in theaters. This has been episode 307 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Tuesday morning here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.